3 years ago, I made the decision to walk away from my partner role at KPMG, where I earned around £500,000 a year. And it was terrifying. I wasn't entirely sure if what I was about to do was brilliant or a terrible idea. But what I knew for certain was that another year would mean staying in a role that had been great, but was now going to stop me from reaching my full potential. By sharing the honest lessons I learned from leaving corporate, I hope that it will give you the clarity and confidence to stop settling for impressive titles and salaries and instead to pursue the kind of work that most people are too afraid to even consider. Throughout my 22 years at KPMG, I did everything right. I started as a graduate, made manager, senior manager, director, and finally partner. I had big clients, internal leadership roles, and great pay. Everything that I'd worked for. And my life looked really successful to everyone around me. Corporate dinners, international travel, leading big projects, and I was proud. But then sometime around 2021, I started waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning with this gnawing feeling that I was kind of living somebody else's life. And that's when I realized that something had to change. Before I tell you my honest lessons from the first few years of my business, if you've been thinking about leaving corporate to build something of your own, I run a program called Atomic Ambition where I help people to make this exact transition really strategically. There's a link in the description below, so make sure you check that out. So the first lesson that I had from leaving corporate is that your network is more valuable than you think. So when I left KPMG, one of my biggest fears was that I'd lose access to the opportunities and people that came with the brand. For 20 years, every project, every introduction, every client conversation had come through the firm. So when I stepped away, I genuinely thought, well, that's it, right? I'm starting from zero. But one of the first things I did after leaving was to make a list of people who might be able to help me. Not necessarily to sell to, but to get advice from or open a few doors for me. And I started with the obvious group, right? Friends and family. People who I knew or hoped would want me to succeed, and also who might have other useful connections or ideas for me. And after that group, I then moved on to my second group. So people in my professional network that I'd worked closely with and I thought I had strong relationships with. So for me, that was either senior contacts at former KPMG clients or colleagues who had since moved into senior corporate roles elsewhere. They knew me well, they trusted me, and they were now in positions where they could either use my services or introduce me to somebody who might be influential in their company to buy my services. Those first two groups, friends and family, and then strong work relationships, became the foundation for my first year. They were the low-hanging fruit that helped me get moving, and they gave me some of that early momentum. But what really surprised me was what came next. I started reaching out to people more widely, to people that I hadn't spoken to in 5 or 10 years. And that's when things really started to happen. So former clients, former colleagues who had left KPMG years ago and were now in senior positions elsewhere, they were normally really responsive. And it reminded me that relationships don't really expire. So even a slightly warm connection, someone you worked with years ago, is so much easier than starting completely cold, or at least I found that a lot easier. And more often than not, they're really happy to hear from you. And that was one of the nicest surprises of my transition, realizing that your network is far more valuable and far more alive than you may think. People remember how you made them feel. They remember how you showed up for them. And many of them genuinely want you to succeed. They just need to know what you're doing now and how they can help. I remember one person ended up working with me because of a specific conversation I'd had with her 13 years previously that had been so positively impactful for her career at the time, but I just had no idea then or until I spoke with her 13 years later. So if you're thinking about leaving corporate, don't assume that you're going to have to build everything from scratch. Start with your close circle, and then move to those strong professional relationships and finally connect to the people from your broader past network. You'll be surprised about how quickly momentum can build once you start those conversations. Okay, so that's the first lesson about your network most likely being more valuable than you currently think. The second lesson I learned was that clarity and confidence about what you're doing come after you start actually doing it. So when I left KPMG, I thought I had a clear plan. I'd spent quite a lot of time thinking about my proposition, mapping out my first year, building a financial buffer, and I was convinced that once I'd left, I'd step straight into my new career as a full-time executive coach. But within a few months, things started to evolve in ways that I hadn't expected. So the coaching work was going well, but then opportunities started coming from directions that I hadn't planned for at all. So a client I was coaching invited me to speak at an internal event at their company, which then led to more speaking opportunities. Then one company asked me to run a masterclass for their senior leaders. Another wanted me to work with a group rather than individuals. And before long, what had started as I'm going to be an executive coach became something much broader than that. So it was a mix of executive coaching, international speaking, running Atomic Ambition, and even taking on a non-executive director role. I speak to many people who do similar things to me, and often they'll say that their mix of things was all part of the plan. And I must admit, I'm always a little skeptical about people joining the dots retrospectively. So looking back for myself, it does all make sense that those things happened in that order. You know, the coaching opened the door to speaking. Success in coaching and speaking helped build my personal brand. My personal brand created opportunities for Atomic Ambition. So one step flowed into the next, but only really because I was already in motion. And that was the real lesson for me, that clarity doesn't come from thinking, from planning. It comes from doing, from trying things out. You know, you can't plan your way to confidence. You have to build it through the actions that you're taking. Before you make your leap, you'll think that you need everything figured out, your offer, your niche, your marketing, your 5-year vision. But you can't possibly know all that until you're in the arena, actually talking to clients, testing ideas, and seeing what energizes you. So for me, the real clarity came once I had the space and the headroom to experiment. I discovered what I enjoyed, what worked commercially, and what didn't. And with every small win, my confidence grew. So if you're waiting for perfect clarity before you start, unfortunately, you'll be waiting forever. Start with what you know now and take those first few steps, and then trust that the next few steps will become obvious once you're moving. Okay, so that's the second lesson about the clarity and confidence about what you're going to do only really coming after you start. So the third lesson I learned was that it's hard work, but of the good kind. When I left my corporate job and started my business, I had an idea that life would be a bit calmer, more freedom, fewer meetings, more time to think. And at first it was. But that didn't last too long, because when it's your own business, you're kind of all in, right? You care deeply about every detail, every client, every opportunity, every conversation. And the truth is, I work similar hours now to the long hours that I used to work in my corporate role. But those hours feel completely different to me. So back then, the long hours were something that I had to do. There were, deadlines, expectations, internal demands. But now there's something that I choose to do. And I think that's because when you're building something that's yours, something that reflects who you are, it's impossible not to throw yourself into it. So in that first year after leaving, I was probably working harder than ever, experimenting, refining, saying yes to new opportunities, learning how to run a business as well as deliver the work. And there were moments where it was exhausting, but it was also energizing, because even when I was tired, I was doing work that mattered to me. And that's the distinction I think most people miss. Hard work isn't the enemy, but misaligned work is. When the work aligns with your values, your strengths, and what excites you, then you can work long hours and still feel alive at the end of the day. Now, of course, you have to learn how to pace yourself. Otherwise that same drive that made you successful in corporate could push you straight into burnout as an entrepreneur. But that's part of the process too, learning when to sprint and when to step back. And that's much more in your control. So for me, that shift from I have to work to I get to work really changed everything. The hours might look the same from the outside, but the energy behind them couldn't be more different. So if you're thinking about leaving corporate because you want an easier life, don't. But leave because you want a more meaningful one. Okay, so that's the third lesson about how you're still going to work hard, but it's a different feeling when you're putting in those hours. Now, understanding those 3 lessons about your network, getting clarity by taking action, and the reality of hard work won't be enough to get you to actually leave. They'll make it easier, but they won't get you over the hill. Because what really keeps most senior professionals stuck isn't the money, the risk, or even the unknowns. It's identity. I'll explain what I mean. So who you're going to be when you're no longer who you currently are. That was the hardest part for me. For 20 years, my entire sense of self was tied to being a partner at KPMG. Every introduction, every achievement, every sense of worth was wrapped up in that. And when I was thinking about leaving, I still couldn't quite picture me without that title. And then just before I left, something shifted for me, and I stopped asking myself, what am I walking away from? Partly because by that point it was too late. And I started asking, who am I becoming? And that one question changed everything for me. Because when you start getting excited about the identity you're moving toward, rather than anxious about the one you're leaving behind, then that fear of losing your identity starts to fade. You stop seeing it as losing something and start seeing it as expanding into something bigger. So within a few months, I realized I wasn't Mostyn KPMG partner because I was building something new on top of that, a business that reflected who I was now and also who I was becoming. And that shift gave me the confidence to keep moving forward, even when things felt uncertain in that first year. So if you're thinking about leaving, definitely do some practical planning, but also start imagining the identity that you want to grow into. Because the moment you can see and get excited about that version of you, that's the moment that everything will start to click. So look, I'm not telling you to quit your job tomorrow. I'm not saying that everyone should leave corporate. Most people genuinely thrive in that environment, and that's great. But if you've been feeling that kind of gnawing sense that you're meant for something different, if you've been, constantly wondering, well, what if I were to do that? Maybe you've been optimizing a role that fundamentally doesn't fit who you become, then I want you to know something. The thing you're afraid of attempting is far less risky than spending the next 15 years wondering what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to try. Your expertise is portable. Your value isn't tied to your corporate title, and the version of you that exists outside of that safe corporate structure, that person is probably far more capable than you're giving yourself credit for. The question isn't therefore whether you can afford to leave. The question is whether you can afford to stay in work that's slowly killing your potential. So if you're a senior professional who's seriously considering leaving corporate to build something of your own, I run a program called Atomic Ambition, where I help people make this exact transition using a clear plan that minimizes risk while maximizing your chances of success. You can find a link to it in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, you should watch this one next on the 4 professional habits keeping you stuck. Because understanding why you're stuck is just as important as understanding how to get unstuck. I'll see you there.